The year was 1932, and autumn had come early to the small town of Dunbrook. The morning air smelled of damp earth and hay as the first frost glittered over the fields. The harvest was in full swing, and with it came the annual excitement for the town's fall festival. The townsfolk, draped in woolen scarves and flannel, buzzed with anticipation of pies, hay rides, and the famed pumpkin patch contest. Every year, the largest, most perfect pumpkins were displayed in the town square. Prizes were handed out, and the patch's bounty celebrated. But this year, something felt off. Walter Harker, the oldest farmer in Dunbrook, stood at the edge of the town square, his sunken eyes scanning the bustling market with a grimace. His hands, worn from decades of tilling the land, gripped his cane as he watched the younger farmers haul in their pumpkins. These were not the pumpkins he had grown up with, no. They were from the cursed patch. Harker had told them. For years he'd been telling anyone who would listen, but no one ever did. That patch ain't right, he muttered to himself, shaking his head as a group of children ran past him, laughing and carrying armfuls of small pumpkins. Their joy sickened him, not because he despised children, but because he knew the truth. Two men, brothers by the name of Douglas, were setting up their stall nearby. They had taken over Harker's land 2 seasons ago when he was too old to manage it on his own. The soil was rich there, had always been, and they'd made a fortune off the pumpkins that grew so effortlessly in that field. The pumpkins were massive, orange as the setting sun, with smooth skins that practically gleamed under the autumn light. "Morning, Mr. Harker," called John Douglas, the younger of the two brothers, as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "What do you think of the harvest this year? Ain't it the best one yet?" Harker's knuckles whitened around his cane. He spat into the dirt and fixed John with a glare. "That patch you took over? It's cursed, boy. My daddy told me about it, and his daddy before him. No good comes from that land. You ought to burn every one of those pumpkins before it's too late." John chuckled, his face red from exertion. "Ain't no curse, just good soil and hard work. You're too superstitious for your own good, Mr. Harker." But Harker didn't laugh. "The land's too good, boy. You ever ask yourself why it yields so much? My daddy always said that blood was spilled there. Old magic, dark things. They don't stay buried forever." John, unbothered by the old man's warnings, waved him off with a dismissive gesture. "Folks said the same thing about this town when the railroad came through. You can't live in the past, Mr. Harker." The old farmer turned away, his mouth set in a thin line. It wasn't the first time he had been dismissed as a relic of a bygone era, but this time felt different. This time the air felt heavier, and the chill in his bones wasn't from the cold. As the day wore on, Harker wandered the town, his warnings falling on deaf ears. The sun dipped below the horizon, and a cool fog began to roll in from the surrounding woods. The children, still laughing, carved grotesque faces into their pumpkins, while the adults sipped cider and exchanged pleasantries. But beneath the festive chatter, the land hummed, silent and patient. In the depths of the cursed patch, something stirred. Something that had been dormant for far too long. When Harker returned to his empty house at the edge of town, he stood for a long while at the window, looking out at the silhouette of the pumpkin patch on the horizon. The fog clung to the earth like a shroud, and the faintest whisper of wind rustled through the bare branches. He closed his eyes and muttered a prayer. He knew it wouldn't be enough. This year, Halloween would be different. He could feel it in his bones, as sure as the harvest moon would rise. Halloween approached swiftly, and the air in Dunbrook felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on the town. It had rained for 3 days straight, and by the time the skies cleared, the ground was slick with mud. The pumpkins, however, seemed to thrive under the gloom. They were larger than ever, their deep orange skins practically glowing beneath the pale, late October sun. That night, as the last rays of sunlight faded into the thickening dusk, a group of teenagers gathered near the edge of the old pumpkin patch. They huddled close, their breath visible in the cool night air, a thrill of rebellion sparking in their eyes. At the center of the group was Tommy Clark, a lanky, sharp-featured boy with a mischievous grin. "We've heard the stories all our lives," Tommy said, gesturing toward the sea of pumpkins that stretched out before them. "It's just a bunch of nonsense old Harker made up to scare us. The patch is perfectly fine, right?" The others nodded in agreement, but their voices were quieter than usual. There was an unspoken tension, a hesitation that hung over the group. They had all heard the warnings from their parents about going into the patch after dark. The legends were old, passed down from generation to generation. Stories of people going missing, of strange figures seen walking between the rows of pumpkins late at night. No one ever talked about it in detail, but everyone in Dunbrook knew that something wasn't right with that land. Still, teenage bravado won out. Tommy's best friend Sam kicked at the soft earth with a smirk. "Come on, it's just a bunch of overgrown squash. What's the worst that could happen?" Tommy grinned. "Exactly. So let's prove it." They crossed the wooden fence that separated the town from the patch, stepping into the field with a mixture of excitement and unease. The pumpkins loomed larger up close, their thick vines twisting like veins across the dark earth. The moon, nearly full, cast long shadows between the rows, turning the landscape into a jagged maze of orange and black. As they ventured deeper into the patch, the night grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and wind through the trees had vanished, leaving only the soft squelch of their boots in the wet soil. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it felt as though the pumpkins were watching them. Sam snorted, breaking the silence. "This is what everyone's so scared of? Please, they're just pumpkins." But as he spoke, something shifted in the patch, a soft rustle like dry leaves stirring on the ground. The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Tommy squinted into the darkness, searching for the source of the noise. "What was that?" whispered Jenny, the youngest of the group. Her voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. "It's just the wind," Tommy said, though even he didn't believe it. His eyes darted from one pumpkin to the next, each one seeming more twisted and grotesque than the last. There was a sickly sweet smell in the air now, like rotting fruit, and the ground beneath their feet felt softer. Too soft. Suddenly, without warning, one of the pumpkins burst open with a wet, squelching sound. Dark, oily liquid spilled from its insides, pooling around the group's feet. A gasp escaped Jenny's lips as she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a vine. "What the hell?" Sam started, but before he could finish, another pumpkin cracked open, this one even larger. The stench was overwhelming now, a thick, putrid odor that clung to their clothes and skin. And then, out of the darkness, something moved. A figure, tall, hunched and grotesque, rose from the center of the patch. Its body was cloaked in shadows, but its eyes gleamed a sickly green in the moonlight. It stood still for a moment, its gaze sweeping across the group. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. "Run," he whispered, though his legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure moved with unnatural speed, its long, claw-like hands reaching for them. The teenagers scattered, their screams lost in the thick fog that began to roll over the patch. Tommy didn't look back. He could hear the sound of heavy footsteps, of pumpkins splitting open behind him, but all he could do was run. As he and the others fled back toward the safety of the town, the pumpkin patch behind them came alive with the sounds of cracking vines and shifting earth. The cursed soil had awoken, and it wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, Dunbrook was buzzing with rumors. The teenagers who'd ventured into the patch returned pale and silent, their usual cocky bravado replaced with haunted stares. None of them spoke openly about what they'd seen. Tommy, Sam, and the others avoided each other as if the shared horror would resurface the moment their eyes met. It wasn't long before word of their late-night escapade reached the town elders. By then, it didn't matter. Strange things had begun happening in Dunbrook. Livestock went missing, and the pumpkins left sitting on doorsteps overnight began to rot within hours, their smooth orange skins collapsing into piles of blackened mush. People whispered in the streets, their conversations hushed but frantic. Some blamed the teenagers for angering whatever spirits haunted the patch, while others swore they saw figures moving through the fields at night. No one, however, was as unnerved as old Walter Harker. As the town's fears grew, so did their curiosity. They needed answers. The local historian, a bespectacled man named Henry Lane, was known for his expertise on Dunbrook's folklore. Though a quiet man by nature, the recent string of events stirred him into action. He was determined to find out the truth behind the curse that had plagued Harker's land for generations. Henry spent days scouring old town records, poring over yellow documents and half-forgotten journals in the dusty basement of the town library. There, buried among crumbling newspapers and brittle ledgers, he found it, an entry dated nearly 2 centuries back, written in the spidery hand of one of Dunbrook's earliest settlers. The account was chilling. In the late 1700s, Dunbrook had been a fledgling settlement, its people struggling to survive in the harsh wilderness. Crops failed year after year, and the town teetered on the edge of starvation. It was then that a stranger arrived, a tall man, gaunt and dressed in dark clothes. He called himself Ezra Blackwood, and he claimed to have the power to save the town. Desperate, the townsfolk welcomed him, eager to hear his promises of a bountiful harvest. But Blackwood's magic came with a price. According to the journal, Blackwood had struck a secret deal with a group of local farmers, including Walter Harker's ancestors. He promised them rich, fertile soil that would yield more crops than they could ever dream of. In return, they were to offer him something in exchange, something unspeakable. Henry's hands trembled as he read the final passage. The settlers had not paid Blackwood with gold or goods, but with blood. A human sacrifice was made on that land, and the soil was forever tainted by it. Afterward, the pumpkins grew larger and stronger each year, just as Blackwood had promised. But the patch became a place of unnatural energy. Strange things began happening, animals disappearing, people going mad, and crops rotting overnight. The settlers, fearful of Blackwood's growing power, eventually turned on him. They hung him from an old oak tree that still stood near the patch, but not before he cursed the land. "I may die," Blackwood had said with his final breath, "but the soil will remember, and on All Hallows' Eve, it will rise to collect what it is owed." The journal ended there, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had trembled as much as Henry's now did. Henry rushed to find Walter Harker. If anyone knew more about this curse, it would be him. He found the old man sitting alone on his porch, staring out at the distant pumpkin patch, his gnarled hands clutching a tattered hat in his lap. "Mr. Harker," Henry said, breathless from running, "I found something. Something about the curse. About Ezra Blackwood." Harker's eyes, dull and clouded with age, snapped to life at the mention of the name. He spat into the dirt and motioned for Henry to sit. I know the story, Harker said, his voice a raspy whisper. It's been passed down through my family for years. But there's more to it than just old Blackwood's curse. Henry leaned in, eager for answers. What do you mean? Harker took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the patch. The land hungers for more than blood. It feeds on fear, on the souls of the living. Every Halloween, when the boundary between this world and the next grows thin, the land remembers. That's why the pumpkins grow so large. It's feeding, waiting for the right time to take what it's owed. Henry felt a chill crawl up his spine. But why now? Why is it waking up again after all these years? The last sacrifice, Harker said quietly. It wasn't finished. Something went wrong. And now the curse is stirring again, stronger than ever. This Halloween, Blackwood's curse will reach its peak. Henry looked out at the patch, now bathed in the crimson light of the setting sun. The pumpkins loomed in the distance, their shadows long and menacing. He felt the weight of the curse pressing down on the town, and a sense of dread settled in his chest. Halloween was only 2 nights away. The day before, Halloween dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that makes the bones ache and the heart heavy. Dunbrook was quiet, more so than usual, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The once lively market stalls were abandoned, the streets empty save for the occasional stray dog nosing through piles of wet leaves. The sky hung low, thick with clouds that threatened more than just rain. Henry Lane couldn't shake the dread that had settled in his chest. After his conversation with Walter Harker, the weight of what he had uncovered gnawed at him. The curse was real as the earth beneath their feet, and something far worse than spoiled pumpkins and missing livestock was on its way. He made his way to the church, where the town's remaining elders had gathered to discuss what should be done. The heavy wooden doors creaked as he stepped inside, the cold draft of the outside world following him in. A handful of people sat in the pews. Mayor Goodwin, a stout man with deep-set eyes. Father Collins, the aging priest, whose once strong voice now wavered with uncertainty. And Sheriff Harker, Walter's nephew, whose stern face was etched with worry. Henry took a seat near the front, his notes clutched tightly in his hands. "We don't have much time," he began, his voice echoing in the small space. "The curse is about to reach its full strength. If we don't do something before Halloween night, the entire town could be at risk." Mayor Goodwin furrowed his brow. "What exactly are we supposed to do, Henry? Burn the patch down? Exorcise it? We don't even know what we're dealing with." Henry shook his head, frustrated. "It's not just about the patch anymore. The land itself is tainted. Blackwood's curse is tied to the soil, to the very roots of Dunbrook. The pumpkins, they're a sign that it's feeding, growing stronger." Father Collins crossed himself, his face pale. "Are you saying that the land is alive? That it can think or act?" "It's not that simple," Henry replied, struggling to find the right words. "The curse makes the land hungry. It's a conduit for something darker, something ancient. Every Halloween, when the veil between worlds is thin, the curse stirs. And now it's feeding off our fear." Sheriff Harker leaned forward, his voice low and tense. "What about the kids who went into the patch the other night? They won't say what happened, but I know something spooked them bad. Did they stir it up? Did they make things worse?" Henry paused, the image of Tommy and the others' pale faces flashing in his mind. I think the curse was already waking. The kids might have just drawn its attention sooner. But something else is going on. Something bigger. The pumpkins, they're rotting from the inside out. It's like the land itself is trying to birth something. The room fell silent, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. Mayor Goodwin stood and began to pace, his hand running nervously through his thinning hair. So, what are we supposed to do then? We can't exactly fight a field of pumpkins. This isn't some old folk tale. This is real. Sheriff Harker's face hardened. We've got to try. We can't just sit back and let whatever this is destroy our town. Henry nodded, though his own hope was wearing thin. There might be a way to stop it, but it's risky. The curse started with a sacrifice. Maybe we can end it the same way. The others looked at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and disbelief. A sacrifice? Father Collins echoed, his voice trembling. Surely you're not suggesting we offer up one of our own? No, Henry said quickly. Not a person. The curse feeds on fear, on life. But there has to be another way. Something symbolic. Something that can sever Blackwood's hold on the land. Walter Harker, who had been silent until now, stood up from the corner of the room. His frail frame was still as strong as ever in the candlelight, his eyes sharp with years of wisdom. The oak tree, he rasped, his voice carrying the weight of generations. That's where they killed Blackwood. It's where the curse started. Burn the tree and maybe, just maybe, it'll stop. Henry felt a glimmer of hope at the old man's words. The oak is the heart of the curse. If we destroy it, we might be able to break Blackwood's hold before it's too late. Mayor Goodwin nodded slowly, his face grim but resolute. Then we burn the tree. Tonight, before Halloween begins. As the group prepared for what could be their final act of defiance, the sky outside darkened and the air grew colder. The pumpkin patch, silent and still for now, loomed on the edge of town like a waiting predator, its roots twisted deep into the cursed soil. And deep beneath the earth, something ancient and malevolent stirred, its time finally at hand. The moon hung low over Hollow Hill as a small group of townspeople gathered around the old Harker farmhouse, a mile away from the cursed pumpkin patch. The night air was cold and sharp, the wind whistling through the dying trees like a distant scream. In the dim glow of lanterns, the figures looked tense, their breaths visible in the frigid air. They had come to carry out what might be their only chance to save Dunbrook. The oak tree stood at the edge of the Harker land, a twisted, ancient thing that had witnessed too many dark deeds. Its gnarled branches reached out like skeletal arms, casting long shadows across the patch of land that had once been Ezra Blackwood's final resting place. The spot where he had been hung was marked only by a faint scar in the bark. Centuries of weather had worn away most signs, but the tree still held the curse's dark power. Walter Harker leaned heavily on his cane as he approached the tree, his nephew, Sheriff Harker, beside him. It has to be done tonight, the old man said quietly, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. Once Halloween begins, it'll be too late. Blackwood's curse will be stronger than anything we can stop. Sheriff Harker nodded grimly, gripping the torch in his hand. Around them stood Henry Lane, Mayor Goodwin, and a few others brave enough to face the dark magic that clung to the land. They had brought shovels, axes, and gasoline, whatever they thought could help tear the tree down. But as they stood before the oak, its massive, crooked form towering over them, a cold dread seeped into their bones. We'll need to chop it down and burn it, Sheriff Harker said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. The tree looked more alive than ever, its its bark almost pulsing in the pale moonlight. "This is where it ends." The mayor stepped forward. "We've faced worse," he said, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "Let's get to work." The first blow fell hard. Sheriff Harker swung his axe at the tree's thick trunk, the sharp crack of wood splitting echoing through the darkened field. The others followed, striking the oak with all their strength, but the tree resisted. Each hit seemed to reverberate through the ground, as if the very earth beneath them was fighting back. Suddenly, a low groan rose from the hill, a sound that made the hair on the back of Henry's neck stand up. He stopped mid-swing and looked around. The others heard it too, an eerie, mournful wail, as if the wind itself were alive with something sinister. The fog, thick and cold, began to swirl around them, creeping up from the pumpkin patch below like a living thing. The group froze as the ground trembled beneath their feet, a deep rumbling that sent cracks spidering out from the tree's roots. From the fog, figures began to emerge. At first, they were only shadows, drifting through the mist like faint memories. But as they drew closer, their forms solidified. They were people, pale, hollow-eyed figures, their faces twisted in anguish. Some were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their garments tattered and torn. Henry recognized a few, figures from Dunbrook's past, long dead and buried, the lost souls of the cursed land. They're coming out of the ground," Jenny whispered, her voice trembling as she gripped her father's arm. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the ghostly figures approach. He knew what they were, those who had fallen victim to the curse over the years. Blackwood's curse didn't just claim the living, it trapped their souls, feeding on their fear and suffering for generations. One of the figures stopped just short of the group, its face a mask of torment. It was a young woman, her eyes wide and hollow, her hands outstretched as if reaching for help. Henry could see right through her, but the chill that radiated from her made his skin crawl. "We need to keep going," Sheriff Harker urged, though his voice shook. "We have to finish this before they reach us." But the ghosts weren't the only things rising from the earth. Around the base of the oak, the ground began to bubble and split, and from it emerged thick, blackened roots. They writhed and twisted like serpents, snaking across the ground toward the group, as if trying to pull them down into the cursed soil. Henry swung his shovel at the roots, but they were strong, unyielding. Panic surged through him as one of the roots wrapped around his ankle, its cold, slimy grip pulling him toward the tree. "Get it off!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. With a grunt of effort, Sheriff Harker severed the root with a well-placed swing of his axe. "We don't have time," he growled. "We need to burn it, now!" The group scrambled to douse the tree with gasoline, the sharp smell filling the air as the lanterns flickered wildly in the rising wind. The fog thickened, the ghostly figures drawing ever closer, their low moans filling the night with a sorrowful chorus. Finally, the torch was lit, its flames casting long shadows across the hillside. Sheriff Harker stepped forward, his hand steady despite the terror in his eyes, and tossed the torch into the gasoline-soaked bark. The tree erupted in flames. The fire roared to life with a crackling fury, the flames devouring the cursed oak tree. Its gnarled branches twisted and snapped, sending sparks into the air like angry fireflies. The blaze painted the night sky with hues of orange and red, the thick smoke curling up into the dark clouds. But as the fire raged, the cursed land beneath their feet trembled, growing more restless by the second. Henry Lane backed away from the burning tree, his heart racing. The flames licked at the base of the oak, consuming it with unnatural speed. Yet something was wrong. The ghosts, the hollow-eyed figures of the dead, had not vanished with the lighting of the fire. If anything, they seemed more agitated, their wailing growing louder, echoing over the hills like the cries of the damned. Sheriff Harker stood frozen, staring at the figures in horror. "It's not working!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Why isn't it working?" The answer came in the form of a deep, rumbling groan that shook the ground beneath them. The cursed soil, disturbed by the destruction of the oak, began to pulse and split. Cracks spider-webbed out from the base of the burning tree, and from those cracks, blackened roots and twisted vines erupted, as if the land itself were alive and hungry. Henry stumbled backward as one of the vines shot out toward him, narrowly missing his leg. "It's the curse," he muttered, eyes wide with terror. It's not just the tree. It's the land. Blackwood's curse. It's in the earth itself." The others realized it too. Walter Harker, hunched and frail, stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "It's always been the land," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper over the chaos. "We thought burning the tree would end it, but we're too late. The harvest of souls has begun." As he spoke, the first pumpkin in the distant patch exploded, a sickening crack splitting the night air. Dark, tar-like liquid spilled out of the ruined pumpkin, and from the remains crawled a figure, a twisted, malformed creature, its body slick with rot. It dragged itself forward, pulling itself free from the cursed soil, its glowing green eyes fixed on the group. Then another pumpkin burst, and another. One by one, the pumpkins in the field ruptured, each one releasing a new horror. Creatures with clawed hands and faces stretched into grotesque parodies of the human form. Their eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the ghosts that had haunted the town for centuries. And as they emerged, they moved toward the town with an unnatural speed, their bodies moving as though they were part of the land itself, driven by the ancient curse. "We have to get out of here!" Mayor Goodwin shouted, his face pale with fear. "They're coming!" The group turned to flee, but the ground beneath them was no longer solid. Vines erupted from the earth, twisting and writhing, trying to ensnare their feet. The ghosts followed close behind, their cold, dead eyes fixed on the living, their arms outstretched in a silent plea. Henry, his mind racing, knew that running would only delay the inevitable. The curse was too powerful, too deeply rooted in the land for them to escape. The oak tree, now fully engulfed in flames, was a beacon, drawing the creatures toward them. He knew there had to be something else, some way to sever the connection between the cursed land and the souls it had claimed. His eyes darted to the spot where Ezra Blackwood had been hanged centuries ago, marked by a stone at the base of the tree. The cursed blood, the sacrifice that had bound the land to Blackwood, was still there, still feeding the evil that now threatened to consume Dunbrook. "The stone!" Henry shouted, his voice strained with desperation. "We need to destroy the stone, where Blackwood died." Walter Harker, his breath ragged, nodded weakly. "That's it. The stone is the key. Break it, and we might sever the curse." With the ground still shaking beneath them and the creatures advancing, Henry scrambled toward the stone, dodging the snapping vines and grasping hands. The stone was old, worn smooth by time, but it still pulsed with the dark energy of Blackwood's curse. Henry raised his shovel high, then brought it down with all his strength. The first strike cracked the stone, sending a shockwave through the ground. The creatures recoiled, hissing and screeching as if they had been burned. Henry swung again, harder this time, and the stone shattered. For a moment, everything went still. The ground, which had been trembling with malevolent energy, suddenly went quiet. The vines, which had been writhing and twisting, stopped moving, falling limp to the ground. The ghosts, the hollow-eyed figures, stood motionless, their mournful wails falling silent. And then, as the fire consumed the last of the oak tree, the ghosts began to fade, their forms dissipating into the night air like mist. The creatures, too, collapsed into piles of rotting flesh, their connection to the cursed land severed. The pumpkin patch fell silent, the curse broken at last. Henry dropped to his knees, exhausted, as the others gathered around him. The night was still now, eerily quiet after the chaos. The fire still crackled, but the threat was gone. The land was finally free of Blackwood's curse. But the price had been high. The town of Dunbrook would never be the same. And as Halloween night passed into dawn, the survivors could only hope that the land would stay silent and that the cursed soil would never rise again.
Thank you.